All right, everyone, let's jump in and take a look at lecture 3. We're going to start this lecture the same way we do every lecture with a little bit of review. So our first review question is, how do we deal with externalities? Well, if you recall talking about this, there were 3 different ways that we talked about dealing with externalities. The first one was to monetize externalities, right? Basically, create a cost to the producer that is creating externalities that would either incentivize them to reduce the negative externality or would help make the party that's negatively effective more whole. The next thing that we can do is we can legalize externalities, right? If externalities are affecting a greater population as a whole, then we want to basically bond the producer, right? We want to make them personally liable for producing a negative output into the marketplace. And so legalizing externalities can be a really effective way to limit bad behavior on the producer side. And then the last thing we could do is what Coe's theorem suggests. So that kind of gets us to our second question. What is Coe's theorem? Coe's theorem basically says, hey, listen, there's no need to regulate negative externalities as long as you can bribe, right? So this is closely related to Calder-Hicks, right? To where we could, winners and losers can make each other whole through compensation. Also very closely related to the idea of monetizing externalities, right? We don't have to regulate if we can monetize, and through monetizing, we can bribe one party or the other to accept an outcome in the marketplace. So how do we consider the equity of a policy? Remember, we have 2 different things at play. We have equity and efficiency. And efficiency really says, hey, listen, resources are going to flow to the things in the marketplace that produce the most value. And in that, we have more efficient markets from a price quality perspective, and we see growth and demand for those things that are truly valuable to the marketplace. Well, equity is a little bit different, right? Equity says, hey, listen, we need to spread resources across market participants in an effort to maximize the marginal utility of consumption for society as a whole. Okay, so we gave a couple examples in class where we said, hey, listen, tax policy is equitable, where the higher income are taxed at a higher rate to benefit the lower income. And because the lower income households in the marketplace have a higher marginal benefit, a higher marginal utility of consumption benefit from an additional dollar consumed, then by making this transfer, we can elevate more efficiently the society's utility. So again, equity is about allocating resources to elevate the utility of society as a whole. Okay, what is the perfect information frontier? Well, we talked about price and quality when we talked about the perfect information frontier. Okay, and so the perfect information frontier in an efficient market will be one where only goods and services with the highest quality for a given price exist, or if we said it a little bit differently, the lowest price for a given quality. Okay, so this is something that we obviously observe in efficient markets, right? We see that this perfect information frontier, right? If you're going to pay a higher price, it's for a higher quality. If you choose a lower quality based on budgetary constraints, then you pay a lower price. And there's a lot of positive correlation between price and quality. Well, in inefficient markets, we don't see that same linear relationship, right? We see scattered plots on our graph where there's not a whole lot of price quality correlation. And when we have inefficient markets, it increases the likelihood of misappropriation of assets, right? Allocating assets in a way that is not in line with maximizing satisfaction. And there's some consumer loss, right? There's some loss of utility from bad decisions in inefficient markets. Okay. Now, what do price quality correlation tell you? Again, to go back to what we just said, it tells us something about the efficiency of the market. Lots of positive correlation between price and quality, efficient market. Very little correlation between price and quality, inefficient market. When will we engage in search? Well, oftentimes we'll engage in search when we believe that the marginal benefit of a search is greater than the marginal cost of a search. And this is going to depend on some different things. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail as part of today's lecture. But the efficiency of a market will certainly impact whether or not we choose to search, right? If we recognize a low price quality correlation in a given marketplace, and we know that the likelihood of using our resources in a less than optimal way goes up because of those inefficiencies, then it's more likely that we will search for good price quality correlation in that market if we so choose to participate. So there's other factors that come into play, but those are the ones that we talked about when we met on Thursday. All right, so we've talked a little bit about disclosure. I wanted to share a study with you guys that I think is pretty interesting on the impact of disclosure. And so in part of our discussion, I kind of talked about this idea that sometimes producers will lobby for disclosure to basically maintain the ability to take advantage of consumers, right? So, hey, listen, let's dump so much information in the marketplace, especially when the product or service is complex, that if the user comes back and realizes they had a bad experience, they have no opportunity to say that we didn't provide the information that could have aided them when making their decision, right? And so they'll go in and actually lobby for disclosure. Okay. Now, oftentimes, disclosure can be positive, right? It's not always this negative thing. It can be very positive. When we talked about some examples of that with the Fair Lending and Credit Act, that's not the actual name of that act, but close enough. And we talked about how credit card companies were required to disclose the effect of making only minimum payments and how that affected consumer choice. We talked about how lenders were required to report effective APRs, right? So that borrowers could make apples to apples comparison on interest rates when they were borrowing money. That improved consumer choice. And we could go on and on about effective disclosure that benefits consumers. And so don't let me paint the picture like it's all bad. But this study's really interesting. And this study's really talking about the pressure to comply in the presence of disclosure. All right, specifically in the market for financial advice. Okay, so let's set this up real quick, and I'll kind of go through some of the scenarios that exist in this paper. Okay, so in this paper, there's a dice roll, and we have advisors that have the opportunity to recommend a prize set based on the die that their clients decide to roll. Okay, so there's die A that has a list of prizes that go with whatever number you roll on die A, and there's die B that has a list of prizes that you could win based on the number you roll with die B. Okay, now here's what's interesting. The list, the B list is less attractive than the A list, right? So in other words, A has better prizes than B. Okay, and the advisor is going to give a recommendation to the client on which die to roll, right? They're going to either tell them you need to roll die A or you need to roll die B. Okay, now here's where things get interesting, is the advisor gets to roll a dice if the client chooses B, right? So what we're introducing here is an incentive for the advisor to recommend B to the client, even though B has worse prizes. And here's the disclosure that they make in the study. The advisor says, first, I should let you know that I get to roll a die for myself if you choose die B. I get nothing if you choose die A. So it is in my interest that you choose die B. All right. So a very clear disclosure. I am recommending this for my own sake, not for your benefit, client. Okay. And so there's this pressure to comply. Now, if we think about the financial services industry, right? One of the things that the CFP board requires is a disclosure of conflicts of interest, right? And so let's just say that there's a company and the company produces their own mutual funds. And if the advisor recommends, company-owned mutual funds, then maybe the company pays an additional commission on the sale of that product, right? And so the advisor comes in and says, hey, listen, I work for ABC company. I'm recommending ABC mutual funds for these asset classes. I just got to let you know, if you decide to go with my recommendation of ABC mutual funds, I will get an additional $100 commission on the transaction, right? So they disclosed. The question is that in the client's best interest? I don't know. I just made this example up. If it's not, does the disclosure, and this is really what this study looks at, does the disclosure increase the likelihood that the client is going to use that information in the processing of their decision and be like, man, maybe they're only recommending this because they get the $100 commission, and maybe this isn't my best option. I am going to either continue to think about this recommendation or potentially reject this recommendation. Okay. And so the question is, how does the client respond? And we see something like this in this simple experiment that these authors set up, right? I'm telling you, right? This is not in your best interest, in my best interest, but I'm going to potentially recommend B because of that. All right, so let's set up the control group first, right? Where there is no conflict of interest. The advisor gets nothing regardless of their recommendation. That's the no conflict. So they recommend A, the advisor doesn't get a die roll. If they recommend B, the advisor doesn't get a die roll. Okay, so in this case, the advisor has no incentive to recommend A or B, other than what they probably believe is in the client's best interest. Okay, so in this case, 93% recommend A. And I don't know this to be the case because the paper doesn't say, but I'm assuming if anybody recommended B, it's because for some reason they thought the prizes for B were better. Okay, so 93% recommend A, and the clients chose what the advisor recommended, right? 93% of choosers went with A. All right. So that's nice when there's no conflict. It makes sense. Let's introduce the conflict though, right? The disclosure that we went over a couple of slides ago. With conflict, 88% of the advisors recommend B with disclosure. So our first issue here is with disclosure, the advisor felt comfortable making a suboptimal recommendation. All right, so that's a problem. It went from, it doesn't really matter to me whatsoever, I'm just going to choose what's best for you, to all of a sudden it has an impact on me. And because I get to disclose, I feel pretty comfortable. I told you so, right? I feel pretty comfortable making a suboptimal recommendation. Okay. Now, when there wasn't a disclosure, we see that even with a conflict of interest, 77% recommend B. So it's not like disclosure is the only driving factor in advisors recommending B now, right? The other major driving factor here is self-interest, right? It's more beneficial now for the advisor to recommend B. So With disclosure, they just do so a little bit more aggressively. Okay. Here's where it gets interesting, right? 76% of choosers went with B after disclosure, right? And so what we see here is what we call a pressure to comply. I'm in a relationship with an advisor. That relationship is either explicitly stated or implied to be based on trust. And when the advisor recommends something, it's really hard for me to look that person in the face and say, no, I don't think that's the right recommendation. That feels self-interested. And so 76% of the people complied. Now, when there was no disclosure, only 42 complied. So without disclosure, there's much less of this tension that the client feels to reject the advisor's recommendation. Okay. So that's a really interesting finding. How does it change if we introduce external disclosure, right? Somebody coming in and disclosing the same thing on the advisor's behalf. Will the advisor change their recommendation because someone else is now delivering it and they have a middleman where they're like, oh, are they gonna be on to me and recognize that I'm doing this out of a self-interested position? And does it change how the client responds to the disclosure, because now they can tell an external party yes or no, and not necessarily a trusted advisor? All right. So here in this case, 81% of advisors with third-party disclosure recommended B versus 86 with direct disclosure. And so even though it's not a massive difference, we do see that external disclosure reduces the likelihood of a self-interested recommendation in comparison to direct disclosure. Okay. And then we see that for the client, only 52% choose B with external disclosure, while 84% choose B with in-person disclosure. And so we see a little bit of reduced willingness to make a self-interested disclosure on the advisor side, and we see a lot less pressure to comply on the client side when they can respond to an external third party. Okay, and then the last experiment, there's a couple other experiments that I haven't included from this study in this paper, is where there's a cooling off period. Okay, what if the client can change their mind after the advisor leaves? Okay, so in this case, when we had in-person disclosure of a conflicted recommendation, a big portion of the clients chose B, even though it didn't make sense for them to do so. But after the advisor left during the cooling off period where they could think through their decision and change their mind, 43% changed their mind during this period, right? So what this tells us is that the client recognizes that they're being given a bad recommendation, right? But due to pressure to comply in a trust relationship, they take the advice of a bad recommendation anyway. But when they can tell somebody else that they actually don't think that's a good thing, or when they can change their mind, the client is more likely to choose what's in their best interest, despite the pressure to comply with a trusted advisor. So this is really, really interesting information regarding how disclosure can be a positive regulatory tool, but also how disclosure can be detrimental to the decisions that individuals make, and can potentially even damage trust. When we get to our discussion on trust, one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit more is how disclosure creates recognition of conflict of interest, right? Oftentimes when an advisor and a client come into relationship with one another, the client will assume that the advisor will act in their best interest regardless of what their incentive might be to do otherwise. And as soon as there is a disclosure from the advisor that represents some form of conflict of interest, the client recognizes for the first time that there is an agency conflict, right? Where there might be an incentive for the advisor to take advantage of the client. And when they recognize this for the first time as a result of disclosure, there is some loss in trust, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't know that we should be in a position where there's 100% trust of the individuals that we're interacting with. And so being a little bit more aware of the ways of the world so that we have some level of monitoring and some level of consideration when receiving advice isn't necessarily a bad thing. But it is oftentimes through disclosure that clients recognize for the first time that there is a conflict. All right, so hopefully you guys found that interesting. Let's change gears a little bit and let's talk about what determines optimal search. So when looking at optimal search, there are several factors that we'll consider. So the first thing that we'll look at is the dispersion of expected savings. We're more likely to engage in search when the outcomes of our purchase can vary widely, right? So we talked about this a little bit earlier. We said in markets where there might be less price quality correlation and good products or services might be more difficult to identify, then we're definitely incentivized to engage in search. And so that's what we're kind of looking at here when we say, hey, listen, I can make a really efficient decision, or if I'm less aware, the probability of me making an inefficient decision goes up. We will search in that case. We're also more likely to engage in optimal search, right? Productive, effective search, when our human capital in relation to the domain the search is taking place in is specific to that domain, right? So if I'm really aware of what's going on in a specific segment of the market, and I know that my human capital can help lead me to a better decision in that segment of the market, then I'm more likely to engage in search when looking at products and services in that area. So our human capital can definitely help us. And the reason efficiency is so important is because we know that part of the cost of search is our opportunity cost, right? Our wage rate times the amount of time that we're spending. And so if we're efficient with our time, then the overall cost goes down. We looked at wealth as a contributing factor, right? And basically what we're suggesting here is that the higher our wealth is, maybe the more we have at stake from search. Now, again, we talk about the other side of this coin. For lower wealth individuals and households, even though the dollar amount may be less, the percentage at stake may be more, and in return, the impacts on utility from either good or bad decisions can be significant for lower wealth households. And so I'm not saying that only the wealthy have an incentive to search, right? We can definitely see the other side of that equation, where high levels of wealth might be incentivized to search, but then also those with lower levels of wealth might have the same type of incentive, even though the dollar amount at stake may be less. Okay, and then knowledge of a market, that goes back to this human capital idea in relation to search efficiency. The more I know, the more efficient my search will be. And then also just the availability of relevant, salient information, right? Specifically as it relates to the price quality relationship of the good or service that we're looking at. Okay, so we're going to have the greatest benefits of search under the following circumstances. When there's a lot of price variation, we've spent some time talking about that already, so I won't go back into that again. And then also where there's a low price quality correlation. So we want to make sure that when there is price variation and when there is low correlation, that there's some recognition of the benefit of allocating our time to more informed decisions. This is a good time to search. Now, one of the challenges is do people recognize this? And if they do, can they engage in effective search? And when confidence is lacking in ability to engage in effective search, what heuristics, what shortcuts do people oftentimes go to that might be detrimental to the decisions that they're making? And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about bounded rationality and the behavioral biases of individuals when it comes to decision making. I do want to step back here because sometimes we get into the weeds and we forget about our motivation for understanding these things, right? We're basically saying, hey, listen, there are interferences in the marketplace that might restrict our ability to make good choice, and there are opportunities in the marketplace to make more informed choice, right? And so how can we manage these things at a societal level to help ensure that high quality producers are rewarded for offering good products and services in the marketplace, right? That's efficiency. High quality should receive more resource allocation because they're producing the highest value. And at the same time, how can we make sure that consumers are protected to where they are allocating resources in a way that's in line with their overall objective, which is satisfaction maximization? And so, do they have opportunities to help themselves on both sides? Yes. And are there instances in the marketplace where regulation could benefit markets to become more efficient and more equitable? And so we have to understand the underlying causes of inefficiencies. We have to understand the underlying causes of inequitable allocations. And we have to understand the incentives that create those things, and then the opportunities that can minimize poor efficiencies in marketplaces. And so if we do that, then we can step back and say, all right, where are consumers demonstrating the lowest ability to help themselves? And where are producers demonstrating the highest willingness to take advantage of naive consumers, right? And so if we can't help ourselves in a conflicted scenario, then how can we step in from a regulatory perspective and better position that market to be an efficient market for high quality producers and an efficient market for quality resource allocation decisions on the consumer side of things? All right, so don't get too lost as we dig a little bit deeper into the details with regards to what the overall goal for our understanding is as we go through this material. All right, so back to the greatest benefits associated with search. So when there's little price variation, basically everything's priced the same, where there's low price quality correlation, and when we have repeat purchases, right? If I'm going to be purchasing something over and over and over again, and I'm going to be allocating an increased number of resources towards this over time, then it's in my best interest to make sure that I am making an informed decision with that good or service. And then last but not least, with expensive goods, right? When there's more at stake. Now, we know that technology improves information availability and also our ability to access that information for more informed decisions. Side note, technology also creates an opportunity for more low quality information to be available to consumers. And so information can be a double-edged sword if we can't determine or if we can't distinguish between good information and bad information. If we just assume that all information was created equal, then we may naively choose to input bad information into our decision-making process and in turn make lower quality decisions. All right. But here's an example of how technology improves search efficiency, and it's related to life insurance policy quotes. Okay, so it's really easy for and this is pretty old, but it's a good example. It's pretty easy for someone to go on and request a quote for term life insurance policies on the internet. And Brown and Goolsby in 2002 just looked at this relationship between obtaining insurance and internet use to do so. And what they found was that more people became insured and that the price that they paid for term insurance fell by 20% in the states that they were looking at. And that this impact was the greatest in the areas where internet use was the highest. Okay, so the internet allowed people to look at a somewhat commoditized product and compare it on the right characteristics, right? I can see that no matter which one of these policies I choose, they're pretty much providing the same protection. And so the criteria that I'm most concerned with when making a decision is price, and they were able to make effective search decisions in an efficient way through technology and the information availability that comes along with that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about different types of goods in the marketplace. All right, so let's first of all talk about a search good. The search good is one where the consumer can detect price and quality before buying, and they can really understand the price quality relationship from the search process before making a purchase decision. Okay, so when it comes to search goods, this is where search is going to be most efficient and most effective. One of the things that I gave as an example in class the other day was vacations, right? I can start to differentiate price quality characteristics for different vacation destinations or accommodations for a certain vacation destination by engaging at search. And the more I've done that over time, the more efficient I've gotten at it as my human capital increases in this domain. So this experience is a search good. It's not a perfect search good because sometimes we know that what we think isn't necessarily exactly what we get, but it definitely represents a good that has search good characteristics. We could say the same thing about a mutual fund, right? And so there are very observable characteristics about mutual funds that we can gather information on and we can analyze to make informed choice based on the price quality relationship of a mutual fund that we may decide to invest in. Okay, so that's a search good. The next is an experience good. All right, and with an experience good, we can only detect quality after making the purchase. All right, so I would say a lot of times like a car is an experience good. Okay, where we do our research, we look at a car, but unless we're pretty sophisticated in auto mechanics and variation in different features provided by a car, we can make a more informed decision, but we don't really know how good of a decision we made, especially in the used car market, until after we buy that car and we drive that car for some period of time. And the last type of good that we deal with are credence goods. And this is a good where we can't determine quality even after buying, right? And so oftentimes we would say that financial advice is a good example of a credence good. Now, this isn't always true because there are some consumers that are definitely sophisticated enough to recognize whether or not they're receiving high or low quality financial advice over time. But there are a lot of consumers that don't have the sophistication to really know, right? And so I can have an opinion about my advisor, like they're really nice. They seem to care about me. It seems like they work hard for my goals, right? And all those things are going to shape my opinion of purchase quality. But the reality is, if I don't have the ability to truly monitor the activity of the advisor and use that monitoring to assess quality of advice, then I really never know if I made a good purchase decision at the end of the day. And so that has credence qualities to it, right? Can't determine the quality even after buying. So when we're looking at experience goods, there's a lot of heterogeneity in quality, right? There's a lot of variation in quality, which impacts the efficiency of markets where there are a lot of experience goods. Now, because individuals are risk averse, variation will reduce demand, right? We see this in everything. We could say stocks, right? Stocks are generally considered a higher risk investment class where there's greater variation in potential outcomes from the returns of stocks over time. And because of this, people have a lower demand for purchasing equities because of this variation. And so it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. We just know that the risk averse nature of individuals reduces demand in the presence of variation. Okay. And so there's some incentive to take experience goods to increase search quality for the consumer and increase demand for a marketplace. There's also an incentive to maintain some information asymmetry, right? Where the producer knows more than the consumer, so that the producer can take advantage at a higher rate of the consumer. Now, I say this in a super negative way. Again, I like to step back from the details and go to the 30,000-foot view. We're talking theoretically speaking, right? If our assumption theoretically is that people are self-interested, then our follow-up assumption is in the presence of self-interest, I'm going to have an incentive to take advantage of others and maintain information asymmetry to do so. Okay? This isn't necessarily a statement of how markets work in their purest form, but we do have to recognize theoretically how our assumptions fall into place and guide our thinking. Okay? So what will the producer do in an experience good market? Will they lobby for better information for improved search efficiency so that people can better identify high quality goods and service to restore increased demand and in doing so increase their total revenue? Or will they demand that information asymmetry be maintained at some level so that they can have higher margins on products and services and care a little bit less about the demand impact because the margin justifies the information asymmetry, right? So do I want increased demand or do I want higher margins due to information asymmetry? And the answer to that question from a theoretical perspective is I will choose the one that costs the least, right? I'll choose the one that costs the least. So if it is less costly to maintain information asymmetry, then I will prefer to maintain information asymmetry. If it is less costly to improve demand, then I will demand information to the point that demand is increased for products and services. So that's something that we have to consider on the producer side of this equation when it comes to experience goods. Now, again, with credence goods, product quality can't be determined even after use, making it really easy for the seller to promise quality and fail to deliver. And in this case, if the consumer is never going to know one way or the other, the producer really has no incentive whatsoever to improve quality, right? Now, we could go back and have the same discussion about credence goods that we had about experience goods. If consumers recognize a good or service is a credence good or service, then they recognize that there's a lot of variation in the outcomes that they could experience from participating in that market, and it would likely reduce the demand and participation from consumers as a result. Okay, that's if they recognize something as a credence good. If they don't recognize it as a credence good, then they just choose to participate in the market under the assumption that they're making good decisions, and the people and products that they're working with are working for them. And in that case, they demand nothing else in terms of information, and freely choose to participate in that marketplace, even though of high inefficiencies. That's less likely than alternative number one, right? More likely that the consumer is going to be like, I don't know much about this market. I can't tell if I'm getting good services or products. I'm hesitant. I'm hesitant to participate as a result of that. That's the much more likely reaction. So there might be some incentive to improve quality to increase demand from the consumer. But as long as the consumer doesn't know and is participating, the producer's objective is to create the highest value for themselves at the lowest cost possible, right? Their objective at some level from that perspective is to maintain inefficiency, to maintain the highest possible margin on goods and services. Okay, but this market pretty much will not exist without trust or regulation. Now, a little side note on trust is a substitute for monitoring, right? And so monitoring, we would say, hey, listen, I recognize that you may have an incentive to take advantage of me. Therefore, I'm going to monitor activities. I'm going to monitor product or service quality. And as I monitor, it's going to impact my decision of whether or not I continue to allocate resources towards this thing, right? Good experience, I'll continue to participate. Bad experience, I will drop out and cease to participate with that good or service. Okay. Now, if I don't have the ability to monitor at a high level, then what's a substitute that might allow me to still participate in the market, right? And that substitute is most often trust. So I can't monitor, so I'm going to trust that in relation to this good or service, that you are producing something that is in my best interest, right? Or at a minimum is beneficial to me. Okay. Well, because trust isn't completely adequate, regulation also steps in to limit the behavior of producers in credence good markets, right? Because regulatory authorities recognize this third bullet. There's no incentive to improve quality if the consumer is never going to recognize the price quality relationship due to the credence nature of the marketplace. And so regulation is going to limit bad behavior to protect the consumer at some level. So some level of regulation and some level of trust as a substitute for monitoring might still lead people to participate where goods are credence goods. And this is a market where there's a huge benefit from regulation. And an example that we can look at is, the drug market, right? The prescription drug market in the FDA. What would this look like if the FDA did not exist to oversee production in this area? It would be the wild, wild west. We all know that. And so the FDA provides a ton of benefit to the consumer through their oversight. All right. So what separates the types, right? Well, we can answer this pretty quickly. Certainty of quality and efficiency of the marketplace. Now, one of the things that we realize, regardless of the type of good, is that there is some level of information asymmetry, right? Where one party knows more than another party. And one thing that I would add on to that, the party that knows more has an incentive to take advantage of the naive party. So a sophisticated party knows more than the naive party, and the sophisticated party has an incentive to take advantage of the naive, right? That's a situation where there's information asymmetry. Okay. And so we see this a lot in the marketplace for financial advice, right? The financial advisor has significantly more information about the recommendations that they're making than does the typical client. Okay. And so how do we deal with what are the impacts of information asymmetry, and ultimately how do we deal with information asymmetry? Okay. Because we know that where information asymmetry is present, there is a bigger chance for consumer loss. All right. So again, where information asymmetry is present, we have an increased probability of bad choice because the producer has an incentive to withhold quality information to achieve greater profits if the consumer perceives quality to be higher than it actually is, which leads to a loss in utility. And consumers are basically left with the task of dealing with this in some way, form, or fashion. And so how do they reduce the chance of loss? Well, one of the things that we can do from a regulatory perspective is we can make hidden information more public. And I take this a step further and say, make quality information that is relevant to decision quality more available in a consumable way, right? And so I want to know, for example, like we talked about on Thursday, I want to know what the fees are associated with the mutual fund, right? And if I'm looking at two large cap US stock mutual funds, what are the fees in total? And on a certain dollar amount invested, what is the cost associated with those fees? Okay, so put it in a way that I understand it, right? Don't just tell me, hey, listen, the load is this, the expense ratio is this, and the list goes on down the line, right? No. You can tell me that if you want to. Put it where I understand it. So as a result of this fee, if you had $10,000 invested in scenario A, you would spend $1,000 in fees. And in scenario B, you would pay $500 in fees. Okay. And so we can make hidden information more public to inform decisions where there's information asymmetry. Okay. So we talk a lot about the producer as the bad guy, right? And I don't mean to do that. But the reason we kind of frame the producer as the bad guy in a lot of these discussions is because oftentimes the producer is the sophisticated and the consumer is the naive, right? So the question comes back and begs itself, do producers ever suffer from information asymmetry where the consumer knows more than the producer does? And we'd say, yeah, right. Insurance is a great example of this. And specifically, the feature of insurance that we refer to as adverse selection, right? So adverse selection is when I demand insurance at a higher rate because I know my risk exposure is high. Okay, now I may know that due to my particular circumstances, but the insurance company may have a difficult time assessing that reality. Okay, so what do insurers do? Well, they do the same thing that consumers do, right? They will engage in search through the underwriting process to determine their risk of insuring an individual, and then they'll make a buy decision on that consumer, right? Or other words, they'll price their insurance in a way that represents their risk, right? So they engage in search to reduce their risk, to make more informed decisions, so that they can more efficiently allocate their resources over time. The only difference between producers and consumers in this search process is oftentimes producers are significantly more sophisticated in their search than are consumers. That's just a little side note. All right. If we have incomplete information when making resource allocation decisions, one of the big impacts of that is that the demand curve for the consumer is not going to be accurate, right? In other words, if I have a hard time assessing accurate price quality correlations, I'm either going to assume more value for a given price than actually exists, and I'm going to allocate more money to this low value thing that I'm perceiving as high value. Or on the flip side of that, I'm going to assign too little value to something that might be valuable, right? And so I choose not to engage with something that could be a quality option when allocating resources. So my demand curve isn't accurate if I can't adequately assess the relationship between price and quality. Okay, which means that I'm going to allocate my resources to somewhat of an inaccurate bundle of goods and services where I could have chosen something different that would have provided more utility. Okay. And so because of this, again, consumers are in marketplace where producers have an incentive to maintain asymmetry, right? If I am a producer, again, if I'm self-interested, my objective is to maximize my own satisfaction. And I'm oftentimes going to be able to do that by offering the lowest quality at the highest price possible so that my margins are the greatest. Okay. And if consumers are showing a willingness to inaccurately assess demand curves and allocate their resources towards goods and services that aren't necessarily efficient for their objective, that may benefit me as the producer, and I'm going to have an incentive to maintain asymmetry. Okay. So producers won't disclose, and we kind of talked about this on a previous slide, if maintaining information asymmetry costs less than providing full information. Okay, so remember, maintaining asymmetry is probably going to reduce demand, but allow us to maintain the highest margins possible. And so I have no incentive to provide more information in that case. Now, if I can provide more information to inform better decisions, to drive demand up, and that actually allows me to produce more profit, then I'll actually prefer full information. But when consumers choose not to disclose, it's because they have more to gain from maintaining information asymmetry. Okay. And maintaining information asymmetry obviously is going to lead to large inefficiencies. But the consumer in this case could lobby for more information, but they oftentimes don't do so because they're less resourced and organized than our producers. And so when we look at this graphically, we could basically say, hey, listen, a firm will choose to disclose where the marginal benefit of disclosure equals the marginal cost, right? That is the ideal level of disclosure, even though there may be additional benefits from additional disclosure, right? We see this, our benefit is still positive past this intersection point, but the producer says, nope, we choose to disclose at equilibrium. Once there is higher cost to additional disclosure, then we have no desire to participate above equilibrium. Okay, so we just looked at that point right there. The cost of additional disclosure can be high, right? Either it could cost money from a production perspective, right? I got to produce and provide the information, or it could be costly from a margin perspective, right? Now I've got to provide more quality at a lower price. And so it's costly to my margins at the end of the day. Okay, but with information, we will see a shift in the demand curve, right? Once consumers are better informed about price quality relationships, they will more accurately estimate their demand for certain goods and services, and we'll see the demand curve of that consumer get closer to what the consumer truly desires when it comes to spending their money. All right, so we can see an example of this in a study. So in the spring of 1998, Cornell discloses grade distributions for classes. And we probably can all guess what is going to be the result of this, right? And I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler alert. When Cornell does this, students start to gravitate towards the classes that have the most favorable grade distributions, right? Remember, this is Cornell, where you're in the Ivy Leagues, especially at this point in time. We won't talk about the Ivy Leagues today. But at this point in time, right, your class ranking, your GPA coming out of an Ivy can make a huge difference in your career trajectory moving forward. And so students recognize this. It's probably why they chose Cornell. And so they have an incentive to choose the classes that contribute to the highest possible GPA that they can achieve. And so demand shifts. Enrollment in courses with a median grade of A increased by 50%. And the average GPA at Cornell increased from a 3.1 in 1998 to a 3.3 in 2004. Okay, so information leads to a shift in the demand curve. So let's look at disclosure on restaurant hygiene. How clean will kitchens be if no disclosure, right? So if a restaurant isn't required to basically maintain certain standards of cleanliness, where the regulatory authority that would report cleanliness doesn't exist, right? So there's no disclosure on how kitchens will be, right? Well, they will be disgusting, probably, right? And the actual answer to this is they will be as clean as they need to be to maximize margins. Again, what is the relationship between price and quality that allows the restaurant to produce the highest margins possible on their food? Keeping a clean kitchen is expensive, right? It requires time, it requires labor, it requires other things that may come into play to maintain a really clean kitchen. Well, if those activities don't directly correlate with profitability, then a restaurant would have no incentive to keep a really clean kitchen. Now, on the flip side of that, if a kitchen is such a disaster that the restaurant can't operate efficiently, and it starts to impact food quality in such a negative way that people stop coming, then that's not good either. And so there will be some level of cleanliness, but it would be significantly lower than it would be under a situation where cleanliness was disclosed to their customer base. Okay, what would demand look like if there was full disclosure? All right, now, how many consumers would come to the restaurant if there was full disclosure about kitchen cleanliness at all times? It would probably be impacted in a negative way. It's not possible probably for restaurants to have perfectly clean kitchens 100% of the time, right? And so if there was full disclosure, it would probably lead to increased awareness that could potentially reduce trust among restaurant goers and say, I don't know. I mean, even though it's pretty clean, there's these things that make me leery about going out to eat at this restaurant. And so, you know, full disclosure isn't necessarily the answer as well. What probably is a good solution here are mandated standards, right? We have to maintain these things that we're going to grade you on. By the way, this is how this works. You all know this probably. And if you fail to uphold the mandated standards, then that is a negative mark against how your kitchen operates that could impact the demand for your restaurant's services. Okay. Now, what will happen if disclosure is mandated? Well, in this case, we have a rule, right? And so restaurants will maintain kitchen cleanliness at the minimum level required by the rule. Okay. So that's their incentive. Is it more efficient for the public sector to collect information in this case? No, we're not experts. Or I'm going to answer this in two different ways. It's not efficient for the consumer to collect information here, right? We are not experts on how clean a kitchen needs to be, what temperature food needs to be stored at, where food needs to be stored, what temperature water should be used to wash dishes. We have no earthly idea. Um, but the public sector, right, a regulatory authority can set standards for those things, and they can monitor restaurants efficiently on their kitchen maintenance practices. Okay. Who has an incentive to prevent restaurant testing? Restaurants, right? Maintaining certain quality standards is going to be costly to restaurants. It's likely going to reduce their margins at some level. So they have an incentive to prevent restaurant testing to avoid those costs and operate under the circumstances that we talked about in number one. They'll keep the kitchen clean enough to maximize margins when serving customers. Will people dine out more with full information? Again, we could go back to bullet point number 2 and say they probably wouldn't dine out more, but they probably would be more selective on where they dine, right? So with full information, I am going to see a complete elimination of low quality service providers, right? I'm not going anywhere that has a nasty kitchen because I now know you have a nasty kitchen, right? But I will reallocate my demand to people that have the highest standards in the presence of full information. So maybe not any more or less resource going to meals away from the home, but a reallocation of where that money is going. We could probably say the same thing for fees on financial products and services. What will the marketplace look like if fees are opaque, right? If they're difficult to determine. In this case, we're going to have reduced trust due to variation in potential outcomes from participating with that product or service. And so we'll see less resource allocation go towards those things. Where resources are allocated in the presence of opaque fees, we'll see that producers are most likely operating in a situation where they are taking advantage of consumers, right? Remember, where there is credence qualities, right? Opaqueness would be a credence quality. The producer has no incentive whatsoever to improve efficiency, right? Their incentive is to offer the lowest quality at the highest price. And so where consumers do participate in these marketplaces, the likelihood of them getting taken advantage of is significantly higher than it would be in the presence of transparency. What would demand look like with full disclosure? Kind of the same thing we just talked about again with restaurants. There's going to be a reallocation of resources in the marketplace where it's much more difficult for low quality providers to continue to exist, for low quality products to continue to exist. And so consumers will now make more informed decisions, and we'll see a restriction of goods and services to things that actually represent efficient goods and services. Good price quality correlation between the value that those goods and services bring to the individual consumer and the price that's associated with that value. What will happen if mandated? The exact same thing. People will operate at the minimum standard. I gave the example of my American funds, large cap US stock mutual fund recommendation. Is it suitable? Sure. I'm sure that could be defended as suitable. Is it optimal? Not even close. And so in the presence of of mandated disclosure, then the producer will disclose and will produce products, whatever the case may be, at the minimum of the mandated rule, more likely than not. Again, speaking theoretically. We know that it's more efficient for the public sector to regulate because they have the information and the human capital specific to regulating a market more efficiently than does the private sector. And people will likely be more willing to invest with full information, right? Something that has more experience or credence nature transitions to something that has more search qualities. And if I can search price quality correlation, that I'm more likely going to invest either through the advice of an advisor or by selecting my own products if I'm more equipped to engage in efficient search. So this brings us to Akerlof's theory on separating equilibrium, or the paper on a market for limits. So here's the setup of Akerlof's theory, right? There's information asymmetry. Sellers know more than buyers. And he uses the used car market to set this up and illustrate how we potentially create a market for lemons when information asymmetry is present. And even beyond that, where there's an incentive to maintain information asymmetry. All right, so let's look at this used car example. We have a good used car and a bad used car. Okay, now what we need to understand here is that this car, if we're looking at good versus bad, let's assume that it's the same brand, the same model, the same year, the same mileage, the same color, the same features, right? Everything is equal except for the mechanics of the car and the price, right? Except for the things that is really hard to see and understand that would affect the price. And in turn, because those things vary that are really hard to see and understand, there's a difference in value. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said price. There's a difference in value. One is worth 12,000, one is worth 8,000 based on the mechanics of the car. Again, difficult to assess and understand. Okay. So in this case, we have a two-car example, but we could even extrapolate this out into a much bigger number of cars. But the assumption that we're going to make is that 50% of the used cars are good and 50% of the used cars are bad. All right, so if you told the consumer to calculate an expected value, they probably wouldn't do a very good job. All right, but this is actually an expected value calculation that we get to here, right? And when we're calculating expected values, all we do is we say, hey, listen, what is the outcome of a state? And what is the probability that we achieve that outcome? Okay, so in this case, we have an outcome where we purchase a car that's worth 12,000, and the likelihood of us doing that is 50%, plus a state where we could purchase a car that's worth 8,000, and the probability of that is also 50%. So 12,000 times 50% equals 6,000, plus 8,000 times 50% equals 4,000, equals our expected value. So 6,000 plus 4,000 equals 10,000, right? That's the expected value of the car that we would purchase. In this case, it's the average value, right? You could just say 8 plus 12 divided by 2 equals 10. Okay. So if the buyer doesn't know if the car is going to have good mechanics or the car is going to have bad mechanics, they're going to reduce their risk by offering the average value or the expected value. And so they offer 10,000. In this case, the seller with the bad car is the only seller that accepts the $10,000 offer, right? The seller with the good car is losing $2,000 by accepting $10,000. The seller with the bad car is making $2,000 by accepting $10,000. Okay, so they're the only one that's willing to accept the offer of $10,000. Now, because cars are likely an experience good, the buyer will probably at some point in time realize that they paid $10,000 for something that was worth less than $10,000. Okay, so in this case, in Akerloff's paper, he says, all right, now the buyer, after driving the car, realizes that they paid $10,000 for an $8,000 vehicle. So what are they going to do the next time that they go into the used car marketplace? They're going to offer a lower price, right? They're like, I know what happened. I learned from my experience. And so my willingness to pay the average value goes down. I'm going to pay below the average value because now I'm going to assume, because I don't know, that the car has a minimum worth in comparison to the alternatives that may be available. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is it makes the market for good cars not function. Okay. This is where the market for lemons becomes a real issue. The only people that have an incentive to operate in this marketplace under these circumstances are the ones that can profit. Okay. And only the bad car providers can profit in this situation where the client or the customer recognizes that there is variation in potential outcomes from the cars that they choose. And so it restricts their willingness to take risk. The way they manage their risk is to offer lower prices. The good car provider can never profit, right? They get priced out of the market and they cease to exist. And so now all we have is low quality providers that are willing to participate, and it makes this a market for limits where there's a lot of consumer distrust, a lot of uncertainty about quality, and as a result of that, a reluctance to pay higher prices, even though there will be some offerings in the marketplace that are worth more. Okay. Now, this is a real problem. And so this is one where barriers to entry are not existent, or at least not efficient to reducing the participation of low quality providers. They also, in their absence, reduce the incentive for high quality providers to participate, right? With no barriers to entry, why would a high quality provider choose to come in and compete in that marketplace? Because regardless, price is probably going to be the biggest differentiating component in consumer choice if they can't distinguish between quality. Now, if a consumer can come in and say, hey, listen, I see the price quality difference, and I'm willing to pay a higher price for higher quality, and I know I'm getting higher quality, that's different. But when they can't assess quality, then price becomes the dominant factor that they make their decision on. And there's no way for good quality providers to be able to receive or charge the price and receive payment based on the quality that they're providing to consumers. And so they have no incentive to participate if that's the case. And so this is a real problem, right? And so the question is, what can good car sellers do to offer or to offset this issue? Well, one thing they can do is offer a money back guarantee, right? This is called bonding. If I don't live up to what I've promised, then it will impact me in a negative way. I'll be personally liable for failing to deliver. Okay, so that's a money back guarantee. And that suggests to the buyer, like, oh, well, if you're willing to do this, then you must have a higher quality good. This is also what we would call a quality signal, right? A quality signal is one that is more expensive for low quality providers than it is for high quality providers, right? So let's give this as an example. If low quality providers come in and start saying, well, I'll give a money back guarantee too. Well, they sold a crappy car. When the consumer realizes it's a crappy car, they're going to go back and they're going to exercise their money back guarantee. And so now low quality providers are having to pay back consumers that purchase their crappy cars. And it's very costly to these low quality providers. And so it makes it difficult for them to take advantage of consumers. And if they're going to continually take advantage of consumers, they're going to cease to exist in the marketplace because consumers will stop going to them for business. Okay, so this is something that good car sellers can do. Same thing with a warranty, just a little bit different situation, right? And I would say all of these are examples of bonding, right? I could subject myself to a lawsuit, right? If I fail to deliver under this contract, sue me. I'm so confident that what I'm giving you is quality that I am willing to hold myself out in that way. So this is a good quality signal to the marketplace. Okay, and so this just basically exemplifies the statement that I just made. All right, so we'll talk about more ways to differentiate quality in markets where there's variation in quality across providers. And this is most markets, by the way. But when we talk about this moving forward, we'll probably talk about it in terms of the financial services industry. You guys already got to hear my soapbox to some extent on this the other day in class, right? I think that there are minimum training standards that could be beneficial. I think there are barriers to entry that could be beneficial. I think there is separation of credentialing and making those things more clear to the consumer, what's required to hold certain credentials. And that could be beneficial to the consumer of assessing price quality correlations. Again, there's always going to be a demand for lower price, lower quality goods. We just got to be able to differentiate it so the consumers that demand that know what they're getting. And consumers that are demanding a higher quality aren't falling victim to lower quality providers charging a high price, right? High quality demanding consumers should be able to isolate the segment of the market that is charging a higher price for truly higher quality. And so there's lots of things there that come into play. We want to create, in other words, quality signals that are more costly to low quality providers so that it's easier to differentiate between good and bad providers, and it's more difficult for low quality providers that are offering a bad price quality mix to consumers to exist, right? If you're offering low quality but charging a low price, then you should have a place in the marketplace. But if you're offering low quality and charging a high price, then it should be very difficult for you to exist because of the inefficiencies that you bring to the market. So we can get rid of those bad players by helping the consumer identify quality signals. Okay. So this kind of wraps up our discussion for lecture number 3. I'll be back with lecture number 4 in the very near future. Hope you guys enjoy. Write down your questions. I definitely want to go over these questions with you in our next meeting together. So take good notes, write down your questions, and we can address any of this stuff in more detail when we're together next. Thanks, guys.